The machinery of slavery. They did not call it a machine at first. Machines are loud, visible, unmistakable. This was quieter. It creaked like wood, breathed like men, and prayed like Christians. It wore law as a uniform and scripture as a mask. It did not announce itself as cruelty. It introduced itself as order, before it had a flag, before it had a constitution, before it had a name. America had a system. The first cargo in 1619, a ship arrived at Point Comfort in the English colony of Virginia. The land was new to Europeans, but violence was not. The ship carried no gold, no spices, no silks. It carried people. They were Angolans, captured in war, sold multiple times before ever seeing the Atlantic. By the time they reached the English colonists, they were no longer seen as individuals with languages, families, or gods. They were inventoried at first. The English did not know what to call them. Some were treated like indentured servants, worked brutally, but with a theoretical endpoint. Yet something changed, quietly and deliberately. Contracts disappeared. Whippings remained. Freedom stopped being promised and began being denied. The transformation was not accidental. It was engineered. Point 2. From labor to property. Slavery did not become American because it was ancient. It became American because it was profitable. Tobacco fields expanded. Rice plantations followed. Cotton would later seal the deal. These crops demanded labor that was exhausting. Continuous disposable. European servants could not supply it forever. Indigenous populations were being killed or displaced. African labor, already brutalized by transatlantic trade networks, was deemed perfect, but to justify perpetual enslavement, something radical had to occur. Human beings had to be turned into property. Colonial legislatures got to work. A child would inherit the status of the mother, ensuring slavery reproduced itself. Baptism would no longer guarantee freedom. Race would become the marker of bondage. This was not chaos. This was policy. By the late 1600s, slavery in America was no longer a temporary condition. It was a lifetime sentence, extended to descendants not yet born. 3. Law as a weapon. The plantation was not sustained by whips alone. It was sustained by paper. Slave codes appeared across colonies and later states. They dictated where enslaved people could walk, what they could say in court, nothing, whether they could learn to read, usually no, how severely they could be punished, almost without limit. Murdering an enslaved person was rarely prosecuted. Killing property was considered a civil matter, not a criminal one. The enslaved existed in a legal limbo, alive enough to suffer, not alive enough to matter. Courts, sheriffs, militias, and patrols formed an ecosystem of enforcement. Ordinary white citizens were encouraged, sometimes required, to participate. The system did not merely enslave black people, it enlisted white people. Slavery became a shared investment. Point 4. The myth of benevolence. To live with such brutality, a story had to be told. Ministers preached that slavery was divinely ordained. Pseudoscientists claimed Africans were biologically suited for servitude. Politicians warned that freedom would bring chaos, rape, and revenge. None of this was true, but it was useful. The enslaved were described as childlike, lazy, savage, or content. Violence was reframed as discipline. Rape became breeding. Family separation became sale. Terror became order. Language softened the blade. Life inside the machine. The reality on plantations bore no resemblance to the myths. Days began before sunrise and ended after dark. Work was constant. Punishment was arbitrary. A slow worker, a resistant worker, or simply an unlucky one could be whipped, mutilated, or killed. Families were fragile by design. A husband sold south. A child taken without warning. A mother left screaming in the yard while wagons rolled away. This was not incidental cruelty. It was a strategy. Stable families created solidarity. Solidarity threatened control, and yet, despite everything, people resisted. They broke tools. They feigned illness. They slowed harvests. They preserved songs, stories, and faiths. They ran, even when hunted by dogs. They revolted, even knowing the cost. The machine was powerful, but it was never uncontested. Vi. Northern complicity. Slavery is often framed as a Southern sin. This is a comforting lie. Northern merchants insured slave ships. Northern banks financed plantations. Northern factories processed slave-grown cotton. Northern politicians compromised repeatedly to preserve the system. The profits of slavery built universities, ports, insurance empires, industrial wealth. Slavery was not a regional aberration. It was a national foundation. Point 7. Independence without freedom. When rebellion came in 1776, enslaved people listened closely. They heard words like liberty, natural rights, freedom from tyranny. Many believed these words might finally apply to them. They were wrong. The new nation was born with slavery intact, protected, and strengthened. The Constitution counted enslaved people as fractions for representation but not as humans for rights. Fugitive slave clauses turned free states into hunting grounds. Freedom was declared universal. It was practiced selectively. Point 8. The machine expands as America pushed west, slavery marched with it. New lands meant new fields. New fields meant new bodies. The domestic slave trade exploded, tearing hundreds of thousands from the Upper South and selling them deeper into bondage. The machine learned efficiency. Ledgers replaced names. Prices replaced histories. Human value was calculated in pounds picked, children produced, years remaining, and still, the nation called itself exceptional. Point 9. What the machine taught. Slavery did more than exploit labor. It trained a society. It taught that violence could be moral if legalized, that profit justified cruelty, that race could determine worth, that suffering could be ignored if normalized. These lessons would not vanish when slavery ended. Machines rarely disappear. They are dismantled, or repurposed. X. The cracks appear. By the mid-19th century, resistance grew louder. Abolitionists published, preached, and organized. Enslaved people escaped in growing numbers. Slave revolts terrified slaveholders. The machine responded the only way it knew how: tightening control, harsher laws, stronger patrols, louder propaganda. It could not imagine a world without itself, but history was already moving. Freedom betrayed when the machine broke. It did not shatter. It reassembled. The end that wasn't. In 1865, the war ended. Cannons fell silent. Flags were lowered. The 13th Amendment declared slavery abolished, except as punishment for crime. That exception was not a footnote. It was a door. 4 million people emerged from bondage into a nation that had never intended to make space for them. They had no land, little money, few legal protections, and a population around them that had lost a war but not its beliefs. Freedom arrived without infrastructure, without safety, without commitment. Former enslavers called it chaos. Freed people called it fragile hope. Point 2. Reconstruction's brief light. For a moment, just a moment, the impossible seemed possible. The Freedmen's Bureau opened schools, negotiated labor contracts, reunited families. Black men voted, held office, wrote constitutions. Public education expanded. Hospitals were built. Citizenship was redefined. It was the most democratic experiment America had ever attempted, and it terrified those who had ruled without challenge. 3. The counterattack. White resistance organized quickly and violently. Paramilitary groups formed, sometimes openly, sometimes secretly. They lynched leaders, burned schools, massacred entire communities. Violence became political strategy. At the same time, laws returned, black codes criminalized vagrancy, unemployment, loitering, disrespect. These were not neutral laws. They were traps. Point 4. The prison doormen were arrested en masse. Trials were brief. Sentences were long. Under the exception clause, prisoners could be forced to work. Thus began convict leasing. State governments leased prisoners, overwhelmingly black, to private companies. Mines, farms, railroads, lumber camps. The companies paid fees. The state avoided responsibility. If a prisoner died, another replaced him. Mortality rates were staggering. Beatings were routine. Medical care was non-existent. This was slavery without the pretense of ownership. freedom had been reclassified as criminality. V. Sharecropping, debt in disguise. Those not imprisoned were offered contracts. Sharecropping promised land access in exchange for labor. In practice, it created permanent debt. Landowners controlled prices, supplies, accounting. At the end of the year, black farmers often owed more than they earned. Leaving meant arrest. Staying meant exploitation. Chains had become numbers. Vi. The federal retreat. Northern commitment faded. Reconstruction was called expensive, divisive, exhausting. White unity became more important than black safety. In 1877, federal troops withdrew from the South. Protection vanished overnight. The machine was officially local again. 7. The rise of Jim Crow. Segregation hardened into law, schools, transportation, housing, voting, everything divided. Violence enforced the lines. Lynching became public spectacle, advertised and attended. The message was clear: freedom existed on paper, not in practice. Children learned fear early. Parents taught survival. Silence became strategy. 8. Memory erased. The story of Reconstruction was rewritten. Black politicians were portrayed as incompetent. White violence was framed as restoration. The lost cause myth turned traitors into heroes. History itself became a weapon. 9. What betrayal left behind. Reconstruction's failure was not accidental. It was chosen. The nation had the power to protect freedom. It chose reconciliation with white supremacy instead. The machine had evolved. The stolen land. Before it was stolen, it was named. Before it was named, it was lived in. A continent already full. When Europeans arrived, they did not find emptiness. They found nations. Hundreds of distinct societies lived across the land, governed, spiritual, agricultural, nomadic, urban, coastal, inland. They traded, warred, allied, and remembered. Land was not owned in the European sense. It was relational. Sacred. Communal. This difference would become fatal. Where native nations saw responsibility, settlers saw opportunity. Where one saw continuity, the other saw profit. And where treaties were signed, they were rarely honored. 2. Treaties made to be broken. The United States would sign hundreds of treaties with native nations, and violate nearly all of them. Treaties promised permanent borders, protection from settlers' sovereignty, but treaties were obstacles to expansion. When gold was discovered, when farmland beckoned, when railroads demanded paths, promises evaporated. The law did not restrain conquest. It legalized it. 3. Removal as policy. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act was passed. It did not speak the language of extermination. It spoke of relocation, exchange, opportunity. What followed was death. Entire nations were forced westward under military guard. Families walked hundreds of miles. Supplies were inadequate. Disease spread quickly. Thousands died along the way. The Trail of Tears was not a tragedy of nature. It was an operation. 4. Resistance and retaliation. Native resistance was framed as savagery. When tribes defended land, they were punished. When they negotiated, they were deceived. When they adapted, they were confined. Massacres followed rebellion. Villages were burned. Food sources destroyed. Children taken. The goal was not coexistence. It was disappearance. V. The reservation system. When removal proved incomplete, containment followed. Reservations were established, often on land unwanted by settlers. Promises of support were made and rarely kept. Starvation was common. Corruption rampant. Traditional governance was undermined. Spiritual practices criminalized. Languages suppressed. Culture itself was targeted. Vi. Kill the Indian, save the man. Children were taken. Boarding schools removed native children from their families, sometimes by force. Their hair was cut. Their names changed. Their languages punished. Abuse, physical, emotional, sexual, was widespread. Education was weaponized as erasure. The goal was assimilation, but what it produced was trauma. 7. Blood quantums and bureaucracy. Identity became regulated. The government defined who was native enough through blood quantum laws. These rules fractured communities and ensured eventual disappearance on paper, if not in fact. Genocide does not always require mass graves. Sometimes it uses spreadsheets. Point 8. The myth of the vanishing Indiana's native nations were confined and controlled. American culture mourned them, art romanticized a vanishing people, noble, tragic, already gone. This myth excused ongoing theft and violence. You cannot steal from ghosts. Living native resistance was inconvenient, so it was ignored. Point 9. Survival as defiance. Despite everything, native nations endured. They adapted without surrendering. They remembered without romanticizing. They fought in courts and classrooms and ceremonies. Survival became resistance. X. A foundation written in absence. The American map is drawn over erased villages, broken treaties, stolen rivers, renamed mountains. Expansion was not destiny. It was decision. The land remembers, even when the nation does not. Cruelty as culture. Violence does not always arrive screaming, sometimes it comes smiling, singing, and applauded. The laugh that teaches. Long before radio, film, or television, America learned racism in theaters. Minstrel shows filled halls across the country. White performers blackened their faces, exaggerated their lips, distorted their speech, and mocked imagined black life. They sang of laziness, ignorance, criminality, and joy in subjugation. Audiences laughed. Laughter mattered. It taught. It made dehumanization communal. Shared humor dissolved guilt and reinforced hierarchy. Point 2. Entertainment as instruction. Minstrelsy was not fringe culture. It was mainstream. It shaped music, language, fashion, political attitudes. Characters born on stage migrated into books, advertisements, and children's toys. Stereotypes hardened into expectations. Expectations justified violence. Mockery became evidence. 3. The afterlife of the mask. Even after blackface declined, its logic remained. Vaudeville, radio shows, early film, all recycled caricatures. Hollywood inherited the tradition. Black actors were cast into the same narrow roles: servant, clown, criminal, burden. The mask changed shape. The message stayed. Point 4. Public spectacle of suffering. Cruelty was not limited to performance. Lynchings were advertised. Postcards were printed. Crowds gathered, dressed their children, smiled for cameras. Violence became community bonding. The spectacle taught white supremacy without needing explanation. It reminded black communities of their vulnerability. Silence became survival. V. Science joins the stage. Pseudoscience entered the public imagination. Skull measurements, racial hierarchies, and evolutionary myths were popularized through exhibitions and lectures. People were told racism was not hatred, it was nature. This science gave intellectual cover to brutality. Vi. The language of degradation. Words did damage. Slurs, jokes, caricatures, all compressed violence into everyday speech. Repetition dulled empathy. Harm became background noise. When suffering is normalized in language, it becomes easier to ignore in reality. Point 7. Children learn early. Racist imagery was not restricted to adults. Children's books, games, and cartoons reinforced hierarchy. Young minds learned who mattered and who didn't before they could articulate the lesson. Prejudice was inherited. Point 8. Resistance in culture. Black artists, writers, and performers pushed back. They created alternative narratives. They subverted stereotypes. They risked careers and lives to claim dignity. Culture became a battleground. Point 9. The cost of constant performance to survive. Marginalized people learned to manage perception. Smile carefully. Speak softly. Entertain when required. Disarm with humor. Performance became protection. X. When cruelty feels normal. Cruelty as culture did not require laws. It required repetition. By the time violence appeared, the audience was already trained. Bodies as test subjects. The body remembers what records try to forget. The promise of science arrived wearing the language of progress. It spoke of cures, discovery, advancement, and national strength. It framed itself as neutral, rational, humane. But science, like law, reflects the values of those who wield it, and in America, some bodies were considered suitable for risk. Others were considered worthy of protection. Point 2. Consent was never asked. Enslaved people were among the earliest subjects of American medical experimentation. Doctors practiced surgical techniques without anesthesia, believing black people felt less pain, or that their pain mattered less. Women's reproductive bodies were used to refine gynecological procedures. Successes were published. Suffering was omitted, the knowledge advanced. The subjects were unnamed. 3. Freedom did not end. Exposure. Emancipation did not bring bodily autonomy. Hospitals segregated. Medical schools sourced cadavers from black cemeteries. Poor patients were used for experiments they did not understand and could not refuse. Illness became opportunity. Point 4. The study that would not end in the 20th century, government-backed research observed black men with syphilis, not to cure them, but to watch the disease progress. Treatment existed. It was withheld. Men were told they were receiving care. They were not. Families were infected. Deaths followed. Data was collected. The study continued for decades. Silence was policy. V. Prisons as laboratories. Incarceration expanded the pool of available bodies. Prisoners, disproportionately black and poor, were subjected to drug testing, chemical exposure, and invasive procedures. Refusal was punished. Consent was coerced, punishment blended into research. Vi. Children in the vulnerable orphanages, institutions, and schools became sites of experimentation. Children were infected with diseases, exposed to radiation, or fed substances without informed consent. Their status made them convenient. Their voices were ignored. Invisibility enabled abuse. Point 7. Native and immigrant bodies. Native communities were targeted for sterilization programs under the guise of public health. Immigrant populations were tested, tracked, categorized, the same logic repeated. Some futures mattered more than others. Point 8. Ethics. After the fact scandals eventually surfaced, apologies were issued. Guidelines were written. Boards were formed. The language of ethics entered textbooks, but trust does not regenerate on command. Point 9. The long shadow. Medical mistrust did not emerge from ignorance. It emerged from memory. Communities remembered being lied to, experimented on, discarded. Hesitation became wisdom. History lived in the body. X. Progress built on silence. Scientific advancement was real. So was the cost. The question was never whether knowledge was gained. It was who paid for it, and who was protected from the bill. Fear. INWRTME. Fear does not ask for evidence. It asks for permission. The day suspicion became policy. After Pearl Harbor, panic spread faster than facts. Newspapers screamed invasion. Politicians spoke of loyalty as though it were visible on the skin. Rumors hardened into certainty. Japanese Americans, many born in the United States, were no longer neighbors. They were threats. No proof was required. Fear was enough. Point 2. Citizenship on trial. Over 120,000 people were targeted. 2/3 were U.S. citizens. They were farmers, shopkeepers, students, veterans. They had obeyed laws, paid taxes, pledged allegiance. None of it mattered. Citizenship proved fragile when race intervened. 3. Executive Order 9066. The order did not mention Japanese Americans by name. It spoke of military necessity. Exclusion zones. National security. Language sanitized what followed. Families were given days, sometimes hours, to dispose of businesses, sell property, abandon homes. What could not be sold was stolen by time and opportunism. Loss was immediate. Justice was deferred. Point 4. Assembly centers. People were herded into makeshift camps, fairgrounds, racetracks, livestock stalls. Families slept where animals had stood. Privacy vanished. Dignity thinned. Armed guards watched from towers. The message was unmistakable: you are not trusted. V. The camps. The relocation camps were isolated by design. Deserts, swamps, wastelands, barracks were overcrowded. Winters were cold. Summers brutal. Food was rationed. Medical care minimal. Freedom was replaced by routine. Hope by endurance. Children tried to normalize the abnormal. Parents tried to explain the inexplicable. Vi. Loyalty questionnaires. Internees were forced to prove allegiance. Questions were vague, loaded, impossible. Refusal meant punishment. Compliance meant humiliation. Loyalty was demanded from those already imprisoned. 7. Legal failure. Challenges reached the courts. The Supreme Court upheld the policy. Fear outweighed rights. Precedent was set. Justice deferred itself. 8. Soldiers without freedom. Some Japanese Americans volunteered to fight while their families remained behind barbed wire. They fought bravely. They died. The contradiction went unacknowledged. Patriotism was proven through sacrifice, while freedom was withheld. 9. Release without repair. When the war ended, the camps closed, people were released with little compensation, no apology, and nowhere to return. Homes were gone. Businesses ruined. Communities fractured. Freedom resumed as poverty.x. Recognition comes late. Decades later, the government admitted wrongdoing, apologies were issued. Reparations offered, symbolic, insufficient, overdue, the damage had already spread through generations. 11. What fear revealed. The internment was not an anomaly. It followed a pattern. Identify a group, label it dangerous, remove its rights, justify it later. The machine did not need new parts. It reused old ones. Echoes that RMN history does not stay behind. It moves forward, disguised as normal. The myth of completion. America prefers endings. Slavery ended, segregation ended, internment ended. These statements are true only in the narrowest sense. The laws changed. The machinery did not fully disappear. It was retooled, renamed, modernized. Completion was declared before repair was done. 2. The inheritance of structure. Systems outlive intentions. Housing policies that once excluded became wealth gaps that endure. Policing practices born from patrols evolved into surveillance. Schools funded by property taxes preserved inequality without speaking its name. No single decision created this. Continuity did. 3. Punishment as policy. The exception clause of the 13th Amendment never vanished. Mass incarceration expanded in the late 20th century, feeding on poverty, criminalized survival, and racialized enforcement. Prisons grew. Labor followed. The logic was familiar. 4. Memory and resistance. Communities did not forget, stories were passed down. Warnings whispered. Mistrust inherited. Trauma embedded in family rituals, jokes, silences. At the same time, resistance endured, through organizing, art, litigation, protest, scholarship. Survival became strategy. Memory became shield. V. Culture revisited. Representation improved, but caricature lingered. Old stereotypes found new platforms. Humor still excused harm. Entertainment still shaped belief faster than facts. Culture remained a battlefield. Vi. Apologies without reckoning. The nation apologized selectively. Words were offered. Ceremonies held. But repair was limited. Accountability remained abstract. Reconciliation without transformation preserved imbalance. 7. Education as a choice. What is taught shapes what is possible. Silence is instruction. Minimization is distortion. Sanitized history trains denial. Truth complicates patriotism. That is why it is resisted. 8. The weight of knowing. Confronting history does not weaken a nation, refusing to confront it does. Denial preserves comfort. Truth demands responsibility. 9. The present is not neutral. Every generation inherits unfinished work. What exists now was built. What is built can be changed. But only if it is named. History does not ask for guilt. It asks for honesty. X. The choice ahead. The machine was designed by people. It was maintained by people. It can be dismantled by people, but only if the story is told without erasure, without romance, without fear, because what is remembered can be confronted, and what is confronted can finally end. After KNOWNG. Knowing changes nothing by itself. It only removes the excuse. Innocence is not the same as ignorance. There was a time when denial could claim plausibility. Records were buried. Stories suppressed. Violence localized and mislabeled. But that time has passed. Archives are open. Testimonies recorded. Evidence overwhelming. What remains is not ignorance, but choice. Point 2. The comfort of distance. Many prefer history at arm's length. That if slavery is ancient, it is irrelevant. That if genocide is unfortunate, it is unavoidable. If internment was wartime panic, it is forgivable. Distance absolves. Proximity implicates, the farther away injustice feels, the less responsibility it demands. 3. Benefiting without touching the blood. One need not hold a whip to inherit its profit, land ownership, generational wealth, institutional access, cultural authority. These did not emerge neutrally. They accumulated through exclusion and extraction. Enjoying the outcome while denying the process is the final refinement of the machine. Point 4. Neutrality as preservation. Silence is often mistaken for peace, but silence stabilizes what already exists. It protects the powerful, not the harmed. Neutrality is not absence, it is alignment with the status quo. The machine survives not only through cruelty, but through quiet. V. The fear of reckoning is resisted because it threatens identity. If the nation is not innocent, what does patriotism mean? If progress was built on harm, what does success cost? These questions unsettle myths. Myths are comforting. Truth is disruptive. Vi. What accountability actually is? Accountability is not shame. It is not erasure. It is not endless apology. It is repair. Repair requires specificity, naming harm, tracing impact, addressing consequence. It costs time, resources, and political will. It cannot be symbolic alone. Point 7. The limits of representation. Visibility without power is decoration. Diverse faces in unequal systems do not dismantle those systems. Progress that changes optics but not outcomes preserves imbalance while claiming victory. Justice is measurable. It shows up in material conditions. Point 8. The work no one is born finished with. There is no final chapter where history resolves itself. Every generation decides what it will inherit unchallenged and what it will confront. The past does not demand perfection, only effort. Avoidance is a decision. Engagement is a decision. Point 9. Refusing the machine. The machine does not collapse all at once. It weakens when laws change. It stutters when culture shifts. It breaks when enough people refuse to maintain it. Refusal is cumulative. X. What comes after knowing? After knowing, innocence is gone, but agency remains. One can deny, one can defend. Or one can act. History does not watch, people do, and the future will not ask what was comfortable. It will ask what was done.